We're back. Hello, everybody. Sorry for the long hiatus, but between the combination of holidays, some family commitments, as well as some professional commitments, we've been a little behind on our production as of late. But now I'm excited to say that we are back and running at full throttle. Not only that, but we've actually gotten some new faces that are very interested in being involved in our podcast as well. For those of you who have been the faithful listeners of this podcast, our astute fourth-year medical student Reagan Washist is scheduled to graduate this spring, and then she'll be off to Denver for a emergency medicine residency, which is huge, exciting news. But don't worry, she has already expressed a desire to stay on in some capacity, so you will still likely hear from her again, especially over the next few months, but then she'll probably be restricted a little bit more to her commitments as an intern. As she is preparing for her next step, she has been doing a little bit of headhunting for us and has found us a couple more med students who are very interested in getting involved, both hailing from UND, and I'm very excited to introduce Marie Tate and Jason Kells. Undoubtedly, we will have them on for an interview so you can learn a little bit more about them, but they're both very eager to be involved not only in the project that is our EMS podcast, but also help me with some of my rural crews. So we're pretty excited about having some more fresh faces, some people that are better suited for some of the social media aspects, so keep an eye out for updates on our social media pages, including Instagram as well as Facebook. Thanks much to Marie Tate for taking that task on. So, what should we expect in the upcoming weeks to months? We still have quite a few protocols to get polished up before Reagan leaves, and so you better be prepared for a deluge of a variety of scenarios, including stroke, hypothermia, as well as many other exciting topics that will be coming very, very soon. In addition to this, we are starting to look into some other options for podcast content, including some additional discussions for EMS across the pond with our most esteemed colleague from Poland, Livia Van Humbeek. Hopefully I pronounced that right, Livia. I apologize if I didn't. I also have a few friends from various circles, including flight EMS, ground EMS, as well as stroke neuro, and hopefully several other guests over the next couple months to follow. If there is anyone out there who thinks they have something to contribute to the world of rural EMS, please don't hesitate to reach out at any of our contact information that you can find on our podcast or on our website. The segment you are going to be listening to shortly is a conversation that Phil and I had while waxing on the nuances of education, not only in the EMS world, but the medical field abroad. We figured this would be a nice way to wade back into the world that is rural EMS and the lifelong search for knowledge. So sit back, grab your beverage of choice, and enjoy the ride. Welcome back, everybody.
The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from this podcast is at the user's own risk. The content of this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. The opinions and ideas expressed are those of the hosts and guests and do not necessarily represent the views and opinions of any organizations we may be affiliated with. As always, follow your local protocols. Hello, podcast listeners, and welcome back to the Medics, Musings, and Mayhem podcast. I'm your host, Phil J., live from Chicago, and with me, as always, Dr. David Collins. It's been a minute, sir. How are you?
The holidays are always a busy time, aren't they?
You know, if you've been listening or following shows, like we took a little bit of a break. It wasn't planned, but both Doc and I and Reagan are each in our spheres of work and learning, and things got busy, and then added on to that the holiday season, and here we are end of January. So we appreciate you if you're coming back to us listening. We do have plans for shows coming up and audio coming up to release, and so we hope you stay with us, and we're glad that you are staying with us. But today we're just gonna sort of get back into it kind of easily, and we're going to discuss a couple things that I think we've been wanting to chat about. I texted Doc this evening. I was like, "Hey, you want to record?" And he's like, "Yeah, sure." So
That's
hopefully
how
you
the best
enjoy this.
podcasts do their thing, I feel like.
That's it. Yeah, I think that's a good recipe for success. So we're gonna discuss a couple things. Doc, take it away. What do we want to talk about tonight?
Well, we've been busy with our stuff. I mean, Phil, you're taking extra work in the trauma department, and Reagan is off in ICU land right now as she's prepping for bigger and better things here when she graduates in the spring. But in the meantime, Reagan and I got to go down to NMSP, so the National EMS Physicians Conference that this year was held out in sunny San Diego, and it was a glorious time. We were a little bit bummed that our third party member could not travel with us. You were greatly missed, obviously.
Thank
But
you.
man, what a wonderful conference. I have to say that Reagan and I talked about this while there, but I maintain that I really like the NAMSP conference more than I do ASEP. And that's nothing against ASEP. I think sometimes that the really big conferences, you just get so lost in the swell and all the big names in emergency medicine, and you just try to like fight for all the conference seats and whatnot. And I feel like NAMSP is just not to that volume yet, though I know that's part of what their goal is. But I feel like there's just such a more tight-knit group of folks that legitimately care about their EMS crews, and they just want to educate themselves and one another about what are the best current practices out there. And there was really some good discussions out there. And
But
I feel like one of the things.
if you're listening, ASEP is the American College of Emergency Physicians, and they have their annual conference. So talk about conferences,
Yeah.
right? And then
Yeah. So
NAEMSP, this is all the medical directors get together, right?
yeah, all the medical directors, you'll see some paramedics there, EMTs, some PhDs, medical students, not nearly as many of those. So I feel like sometimes people get excited when they see a medical student at that conference. But in the emergency medicine field, we've got ACEP, which is the American College of Emergency Physicians, the Society of Academic Emergency Medicine, SAEM is another one.
There's a few
There's a
organizations.
few, and each one does kind of their own thing is the important thing. So ASEP is kind of the general practice emergency medicine updates at re-educating ourselves. It's kind of like a mini residency rehash in many ways, but then there's also the new advancements and whatnot. Like we said, NAMSP is more geared for the medical directors of the US. And places like SAAM are more geared for like the academia, the journal processes, that kind of stuff. So those are kind of the
Yeah.
big delineations. So for people like me and Phil, we like the detail, we like learning stuff. So ASEP and NMSP is kind of where that stuff's at. But let's talk education in general. I feel like this is something that you can either do it really, really well or you can do it really, really bad. So we're gonna flip the tables a little bit here. We're gonna target Phil on this one. Phil, I sat in on a talk, and I won't get into the details because it was a very detailed discussion. But I had a gentleman who's a PhD who was also a medic in another life, probably still doing some medic time now, who made the argument that protocols are detrimental to patient care in pre-hospital setting.
Yeah, I mean, on the surface, I would say, depending on what camp you're in, that might ruffle a few feathers. I will say that there are instances where the application of protocols seems to be going well for people. You give people a clear guideline to follow and clear indications of when to follow those guidelines, and then you get some result versus someone just sort of standing there and doing nothing. I've seen that in the urban environment, large place where I'm from. You see sort of the application of protocols that kind of really control everything you do, and they're very sort of mother may I. I'm very lucky. I sort of exist on the outskirts of Chicago where I don't feel like my protocols are like that. But I can see people who would argue like, hey, listen, what you also end up with sometimes, and this there are a lot of factors competing here. What you end up sometimes with is medics and EMTs who are cookbook, where they just sort of like go down the protocol, and if it's not in the protocol, then it's not something that's being done or being considered. And I think it leads a lot to anchoring bias. I think it leads a lot to people arguing that, well, I didn't do this or I didn't consider that because it's not in the protocol. And so I wash my hands of the need to sort of think outside the box to care for this patient appropriately.
And you
Um,
mentioned the anchoring bias, Phil. Why don't you unpack what that is? Because not
yeah,
everyone knows the 47 biases that are
sure.
present in research.
Yeah, I mean, you can sort of develop an idea of what you think is going on based on not necessarily a set of concrete circumstances. It's just sort of your take on what you think is happening. And this is in the context of the ambulance. And then you stick to that without keeping open to the possibility that it could be something else. Right. So you have an idea of what is wrong with this person. I think he's drunk. Why? Well, because he smells like alcohol and he's a homeless guy we pulled off the bus. Okay. And in anchoring my bias in that way, I have now essentially washed away all any possibility. This could actually be someone who is also sick of something else, in addition to potentially being under the influence or not at all. But I've now erased the possibility in my mind that it could be something else. And I'm just going to sort of go down that algorithm, and that's all this person is going to get.
You've
That's where I,
effectively missed the head bleed that this gentleman
right,
might have had in the ambulance by
right.
assuming
You,
this was alcohol driven only.
yeah, you missed the deadly indications of diagnosis because you started to only look down one pathway. And I think that overly restrictive and poorly taught protocols lead to this kind of pre-hospital medicine.
And
I've
I liked
seen
how
it
you phrased that. Poorly taught, I think, is kind of the
poorly
key
taught.
point here. And this guy did this presentation. It was like, I think it was a 30-minute talk. It could have been an hour. And the poor guy, I think, wanted to go for like another 30 minutes, understandably so, because this was his dissertation. So, for those of you that don't understand the graduate school world, people that have PhDs, they have to do what's called a dissertation, which is like their grand research project. This is what's going to get them the letters after their name. And so this individual had decided that in my previous life as a paramedic, I wanted to apply my degree of psychology and try to better understand how the human brain processes protocols, basically. And what he discussed in the data that he could get to, I thought was really compelling and really interesting because I think this points to a lot of things. Is that generally speaking, after he had done his separating them into different groups and reviewing protocols by I think it was 2 or 3 different agencies, the people that did the best or felt that the protocols are the most helpful were the newbies. So the ones that are fresh out of their training, ready to go, scared, know enough to hurt somebody. So they really liked having those protocols there. And then the veterans. So the ones that have been doing this for 20 or 30 years because they like to just kind of quickly glance at it and just make sure they're doing the right stuff. But that middle chunk, and I'm trying to remember what the range was. I think it was like 1 to 4 years, and it was like 5 to 10, and then it was 10 beyond. That middle group, which you have to assume is a pretty big chunk of your crew, in this particular location said the protocols weren't as helpful. So there's this whole discussion that he puts forward that algorithmic protocols lead to problems and there should be more emphasis on education, or at least finding a different avenue to promote education and learning. And I think you can speak to this too, Phil. I've seen protocols over the years that I've been a resident and a medical student, or seen examples out there where you look at the protocol and there's like 2 pages of education, just like walking you through the pathophysiology of asthma. And then you finally get to the page that matters. And it's just like death by PowerPoint, but in this case, death by paragraph.
Yeah, definitely the presentation is going to matter. Not only in the written protocol or the access to sort of the availability of the written protocol, but then how it's presented in CE monthly or however often you do your CE. I think a lot of times people go, we have CE, and then they roll their eyes and they're like, oh God. And they're going to sit through or click through or sort of, halfway phone it in. And they may pick up 1 or 2 things, but a lot of times it's a requirement. They have to log on to the platform and make sure that they get their certificate so that they get their hours. And we've sort of made this a thing that, a hurdle you have to get over and get through instead of really capitalizing on the fact that it could be a learning opportunity. Some of my favorite examples of when you can take this and really make it into a good learning opportunity is take real cases. It takes a little bit more work, but if you can pull real cases from the area and go, hey, this was a case that happened last month. This is what occurred. This is some of the observations that we made, being able to sort of Monday morning quarterback this. If you run across this, consider these things. I think that stands up way more than sort of trying to have somebody memorize step by step the recipe in a protocol. And I think when you can relate it to how these people learn, because let's be honest, EMS folks are a special breed, right? Not everyone can do the work that happens in the back of an ambulance. Okay. Far off on your own and in the dark, you roll up to Mima's house and anything could be on the other side of that door. Okay. Not everybody can do this. So credit where credit is due. And I think we need to do more to drive in and really go, well, this is a specific group of people. Maybe, I don't know, maybe they have a specific way that they learn. Because a lot of times I think what you find out, and you find this out with folks in the fire service as well, you could sit and give them a million PowerPoints and it just sort of goes in one ear, not the other. But the minute you let them touch it, or the minute you show them an example, real world example, they lock it in, and they lock it in better than most because that's what they're used to. That is what they're used to. The vast majority of the advances in learning during when I teach EMT happen when I get rid of the PowerPoint and I start, all right, let's start touching this equipment. Okay, this is what it's like, because now the brain is essentially building those neural pathways for the small things that aren't covered in the PowerPoint. I'll give you an example. If I tell two brand new EMT students, you are responding to call for shortness of breath. I am your patient. I am seated in the living room when you arrive. Go ahead. They not only have the opportunity to talk to me, but they are now looking around the room, scanning, having to carry bags. Their brain is sort of logistically managing all of these things that is also locking in the fundamental idea of what it's like to approach a patient with shortness of breath. That is where you really, really, really you get to the meat of the learning, and we don't do it enough. And I think a lot of it has to do with time, some of it has to do with money, some of it has to do with flat out effort.
Yeah, and I would say that, in the last, 15, 20 years, education has undergone an overhaul as a whole, but each particular area or division is going to have its own timetable for making that change. So, case in point, medical students, which is part of what I do on a regular basis, is educate preclinical students, clinical students. And I was one of them at one point. And I just did not do well with sitting in a room with PowerPoints day in, day out. And God forbid that any of the people presenting had like an actual clinical application problem related to it. It was basically, here are the lungs. Let us talk about the anatomy and the physiology, but I'll give you no relevant applications. And you try not to fall asleep during that. That's not going to stick in your head. But I'll give an example. I just finished teaching a brief lecture on trauma at the University of North Dakota here last week with the second years going into their clinical years. And I looked at them and I gave them this scenario that I had in residency, which was a 5 alarm fire, pregnant patient, chest tube, intubated, borderlining on resuscitative hysterotomy, like needing to get the baby out now. You start with that, students lean in, they're locked in, they're ready to go. Now, they weren't ready for the next part where I said, "We are not continuing this conversation until you start talking to me." They didn't like that part so much. Like the fact that they had to make their own choices and had to start telling me what they wanted to do. That's going to lock into their brains so much faster than me sitting there pontificating about ATLS version 11 and the differences of that and how to calculate blood loss and how to give this much fluid or this much pressure or what the current massive transfusion protocol guidelines are. Those are all important elements for sure. But if you frame it in the context of here's a real live breathing patient that I saw and stuff happened, but we're going to let you tell me what you would do and see if you would have done the same thing or not. And that's facilitated a lot of very interesting conversations as a result.
You touch on a good point, this participation thing. If you're listening to our podcast and you're like, oh, this doesn't really have a whole lot to do with me, I want you to take at least this from my portion of this podcast. The next class you're in, if you just convince yourself that it's okay to be wrong and that if you say something that's wrong or ask a question that maybe you think you should know, and you stop yourself from doing any of that stuff, from participating in that way, because you think it's going to make you look like an idiot or make you look like you don't know what you're doing, just remember that somewhere in the classroom, there is somebody else that is dying to ask that question and is stopping themselves from asking it. And you might be doing that person a favor by asking that question. I tell you, one of my favorite things to do is to start classes and go, if you ask a question while I'm giving this lecture or give an answer and it's wrong or it's not quite, down the pathway that we want you to go down, I want you to know flat out from the beginning that A, that is okay. Two, I do that all the time. And three, no one in this room should be looking at somebody else who answers something wrong or asks a question that you think they should know the answer to and judge them. This is a place of learning. This classroom right now for the next hour, however long we're in here, is specifically so that you can ask all of the quote unquote dumb questions. Ask all the things you're curious about.
I would add too, Phil, what are some of the situations where you've had some of the best learning possible? Like, where have you learned the most about a patient or about a pathology or an intervention?
We were talking before the podcast, just getting warmed up, and I mentioned to you that I had a patient that I had two interactions with. Same patient, quadriplegic from gunshots, recent young patient, and I both had the ability to examine him and really sort of get from his perspective what he feels, what works for him in terms of positioning and what works for him in terms of care. And then I had a chance to one-on-one, like I was being tutored, ask questions and go step by step with the urology resident who was just fantastic as he went and tried to solve this kid's urinary retention problem. I will never, ever forget the interaction because it was positive, it was supportive. I got to see it in real time. And even though I wasn't necessarily hands on the procedure, right? Sterile procedure, they're doing this thing, it's machinery I don't operate, it's not my world. I got to see it and I learned and picked up on some extremely important tips. That locked it in for me because it was right in front of me. And I think that even in the classroom setting, we have an ability to do that with our students. I've had people come to me and tell me, I've had a lot of PowerPoint presentations, but I've not quite had one like this. And I'm not blowing my own horn. I learned how to do that from people who were excellent teachers when I was learning. If you are truly passionate about education, then be passionate about education when you're educating.
Yeah, if there's one thing I can say more than anything else, and this is part of why I teach at UND, I do point of crowd sound, I work as a medical director, I do a podcast, is that students clamor for content experts. I think one of the biggest challenges sometimes for people is that we don't always get the people that are up to date on some of the changes that have come along, or their passion just isn't in that topic. I can give you an example. When I was a medical student, we had pulmonology as one of our sections during first year. And the person who taught pulmonology is the one that taught cardiology. And he led with, I really hate talking about pulmonology. How much buy in did he have from his students by saying that? Zero. Because now I know you don't like this topic. Are you going to present it in a way that I'm going to learn it? And looking back at it, I didn't. I learned nothing from that time with him because he biased us from the beginning that this guy is not in it. He's not invested in it, doesn't care about us. So why should I care about this content? Having people like Phil said that mentored me as a student, as a resident, and then learning later when I had swore I would never do academia. And then a year in, I'm doing academia as an attending, is that for me personally, I wanted to go back and do better than the people before me. And some of them did a great job teaching. I'm not trying to diminish that fact. But remembering what it was like in that position, whether you're in med school or you're an EMT or you're a paramedic, I think the best educators are the ones that remember what it was like and they want to go back and either do better or try to do their best to imitate someone that was a mentor for them when they were a student. One other thing I would say that's instrumental to the educational process, and this is true for me personally, I know it's not true for everybody. I learn more from making mistakes sometimes than I do from actual content. Generally speaking, I prefer making mistakes in the classroom or in a simulation. That's why we have so much simulation training now for residents, for paramedics, et cetera, is because you can screw up and you can learn from it without there being a patient involved. At the same time, medicine, it's called a practice, right? We're never going to have this fully mastered. So, treating the patient with a medication that doesn't work, or an intervention that didn't quite have the outcome we expected, or I tried to intubate this patient and the airway was way harder than I thought it was going to be. How is that going to change my prep for future situations where something like this comes up again? Sometimes failure or even a near miss, meaning like nothing bad happened for the patient, but it was a moment where something really bad could have happened. Those are some of our best teachers. And sometimes I take those and I apply them to my lectures. If I'm working with a student about a certain situation and they're really struggling with it, if you can come to them at that level and say, hey, you know what? I had a arrest like this once that was absolutely horrible. I felt like I was doing nothing right. Coming to their level and helping them understand that you don't have to be perfect. To go into healthcare and assume that you're going to bat 100%, you're probably going into the wrong field if you're going to think that way. And so by being able to normalize questions, like you said, like there's always going to be someone else in that room that has that same question. Normalizing fear, normalizing failure. Someone messes up in class. Like you ask a question, they completely whiff it. The old way was to make funny, right? Like that was the surgeon way 30 years ago when you were in the OR with them. But instead, we can build on that and say, you know what? I see where you're going with that, but let's unpack that and talk about why that's an incorrect assumption and go this way instead. The student might still be embarrassed. I've been there too, where I've been embarrassed by saying something incorrect, but I learned more from it by having that person redirect it to saying, you're on the right track, but here's where your assumption is faulty. And let's build on that.
Yeah.
Guarantee you, I will not forget that thing again once I've been walked through it for what the appropriate response should have been.
We talked about a case that occurred. It was on the law enforcement side of what I do. It's okay to feel a little bit embarrassed if you just answered something, you totally whiffed this question. You'd be like, oh man, that was dumb. That's okay. Take that opportunity and learn from that. So set your mind up before you even start the class. Hey, if this happens, I already know that this is how I'm going to frame it in my mind. As instructors, if you're an instructor and you're listening, the thing that I want you to take away, and like I said, we touched on it when I mentioned this case with these police officers. If you humiliate somebody, you have shut down their ability to learn you have shut down, at least temporarily anyway, their passion for whatever it is you're talking about. You close the door on the information getting to where it needs to get. And that is the entire point of you being there. And if you're listening to this podcast, you're like, okay, but I'm a new EMT or I'm a new paramedic and I'm sitting in these. What can I do? One, participate in earnest, like actually participate. Two, remember that at some point you're going to be in the chair. You may be asked to teach something. You may be invited to come and lecture. You may be invited to precept a student. Remember what this feels like and how you would want to do it if you had the ability to change it. And three, I would tell you this. If you get into a class or if you're listening to something and you just are like, man, this is just not the way that this information should be delivered, hold the people who are teaching you to task. Make sure that you're letting it known. Hey, listen, I appreciate the class and thank you so much for your time, but I think we might be better suited if the information was delivered this way. Or I have some suggestions for how we can sort of up this. Here are some comments that I heard from classmates. Everybody was just kind of sitting zombied out. And I think it might be better if we got out into an ambulance or if we got out into the field or if we did something that sort of made it more real for everyone. Make sure you're letting the people that are teaching you know. Because if you just sit there in silence and every month the CE comes and you don't say anything, you're not really helping the situation. You don't want to be one of those people that just go through it and then complain for the rest of the month until they get to the next one. That's not helping anything. Let's be a part of the solution, right? And there are lots and lots of resources and lots of really great systems and PMDs out there that are doing innovative things. Obviously, take everything that you get on social media with a grain of salt, but there are some fantastic educators that are giving short form content. And we know that the generations coming up, the short form way of presenting information is where it's at because that's just what they're exposed to the most. So that's what their brains are sort of primed and calibrated for. And I think we have not done enough to adjust how we are presenting information to really go along with how people are kind of taking in information these days. Not to try and make myself sound that old, but that's kind of the way it is.
And the sheer volume of information that's at our fingertips now, too, I think it's even harder to hone it down into the knowledge that's relevant too. Thinking back to being a medical student in 2017, 2018, where your information was still predominantly from your textbooks, the PowerPoints, there was some online resources available, but fast forward to now. Right. MRAP has its own Wikipedia equivalent for emergency medicine on their website, which is super helpful. Corpendium is great. I fully agree with that. Education is a beast in itself, right? Like it's always a moving target. This is why people go and get masters in it and PhDs in education because educational theory is challenging. I feel like one of the things I've come up against as an educator, especially when you get feedback from students, because you're going to get some feedback that's the usual class was too long or could have cut this down or I want more details. Like that's stuff you can't fix. But there's always gonna be those one or two people, and I can bring up the most recent one I had when I presented echocardiogram as a pilot lecture to the students that were first and second years. Their response was, "This is great. We love this content, but could you give us some normal images? You gave us a lot of pathology, but you didn't show us or you didn't have any videos playing of what normal looked like." And I was just like, "How could I miss something that simple?" I think sometimes we as educators get in our little boxes and it's like, this is the PowerPoint I've presented 47 times and it's perfect. I think some of us as educators close that feedback box pretty quick. And I think part of that has to do with, myself included, that sometimes we have pretty thin skin, especially if it's someone that's just there with an axe to grind. And I frame this for some of my students and some of my colleagues that teach. If you're trying to meet the needs of 100% of the class, you're going to be disappointed 100% of the time because every class is different. Every class learns a different way. So if you can try to meet the needs of somewhere from 60 to 80% of the class, those are the ones whose needs need to get met the most. The ones on the far end of the spectrum that are really smart, they're going to find the content on their own. They're going to teach themselves. Those people don't necessarily need any additional assistance from you anyways. And that other hopefully 2% or so on the other side, they're either going to get their life figured out or natural selection is going to phase them out anyway. So my goal as an educator is that 60 to 80% where we are intelligent people, but we need someone that can relate it to us in a way that we can incorporate it and go back and learn it and do it again and again and again until we're content experts at it.
So, Doc, what are the takeaways here for the EMS folks that are listening that are like, hey, I'm in a small system. I don't have access to a lot of things. Where are some of the places I can go that I can really get good, solid information? I see you mentioned MRAP, and I think I 100% agree. What a fantastic resource. So if you don't know, it's a group of physicians. I think they're mostly West Coast folks. They're all EMS, or excuse me, emergency medicine folks. There's a cost to it. They have a whole universe and they need to pay for it. And I get that. But they give out a fair amount of free, absolutely free content, whether it's on YouTube or any of the sort of other platforms. But what are some of the other resources that you think would be good for a guy or a girl out there getting into EMS or trying to bone up on some skills and they really want to go somewhere with some good information?
You mean besides this podcast?
Yeah, besides the Triple M podcast.
One of the things that I think about, and I know this isn't true everywhere, but I feel like the people that are in the middle-sized towns, or as you said, kind of more in the rural, austere environments, I feel like your best resource, or hopefully your first best resource, is your medical director. And I say that because when I first got here, I was trying to really figure myself out in terms of being an attending and what that looked like, and then stepping into a medical director role and what that looked like. And that's part of how this podcast came into being, because I knew that some of my medics and some of my EMTs were hungry for knowledge, for information, for content that they could process on their own time and figure out, why does this matter in this particular clinical context. And so that's part of what brought up having this. After sitting through that conversation or that lecture alluded to earlier about protocols, one of the big things he hit on too was that education for our medics and our EMT should be a priority. And I think that does fall squarely on my shoulders as medical director, for one. So whether that's coming up with interactive cases or setting up stations for intubation, CPR, scenarios that we can run. I'm still trying to figure out a way to set up a mass casualty sim for our area, because I think that would be a great opportunity for our medics and our firefighters and for law enforcement and maybe a flight crew to kind of interact in that case. When you think beyond that scope, let's say you have a medical director that's absent, which there's a lot of those out there, unfortunately, in rural America, or you've got one that just doesn't have the time, or maybe like me, they hadn't gotten their feet wet yet and they weren't quite sure what to do. I would argue that reaching out to something like NMSP would be a good idea. I think that the people there care a lot about their paramedics and their EMTs. What about you, Phil? What things do you know are out there for people that are like in the bigger cities? Or are there things that you can get access to that not necessarily freely available, but things that someone could register to or get a subscription to that might be helpful?
Yeah, I had a really, really great opportunity to shadow some residents at trauma at Cook County, and they were exceedingly welcoming and super nice. And it wasn't a particularly busy night, so we kind of just sat in the corral there and traded resources. I had a few that I thought I was like, oh, tip of the spear with my stuff. They knew about kind of all the ones that I had, and they had some other ones for me that I couldn't download them quickly enough. There were some apps that dealt with, so I'm trying to teach myself to suture for my next iteration of education. I was interested in the basics of sort of interpretation of x-rays. So they turned me on to Radiopedia, which has a subscription service, but also has free classes, free like basics and intro classes that you can take. There was an app called Fracture, which sort of told you in terms of splinting. And then the same people who make the Fracture app, they make a suture app. And you basically just sort of plug in, it's an extremity, it's a linear incision or laceration. And then it gives you what you're going to do and what you're going to use. I love MRAP. When I can catch their live stuff, I will sit for their live stuff. Particularly for EMS, the urgent care piece, they have the UC Grand Rounds. They do an urgent care, they have a whole urgent care universe. That's like right in our wheelhouse because that's a lot of some of the stuff that we get called 911 for is like really urgent care matters. We know we're going to run into like really sick people and traumas and stuff, but a lot of it's like the sort of more basic, non necessarily non life threatening stuff. And I like that. One of the things they turned me on to was Open Evidence. Open Evidence is an app. You can access it on desktop. But imagine if you took ChatGPT and everything you asked ChatGPT in terms of medical, the answer it gave you, it also cited all the journal articles and then gave you access to the PubMed that it was pointing to. I absolutely love it because when I don't understand the basics of a disease presentation, I could look up the basics really quickly and it's good, solid, literature backed information. And I really like that as a resource. It's very quick and it's free. If you are attached to an educational institution, I've heard this even at the community college level. If you're taking classes, or if you're doing university classes, maybe you're doing some stuff part time, look and see what your library has to offer. You would be astounded of what librarians can do for you. And in my case, my school is attached and has an account with Up to Date. And if you've listened to us at all, we've mentioned Up to Date a few times. It's a great resource if you get in there and kind of learn how to navigate it. But it's provided to me free because I'm attached to my university and doing medical education stuff. So I really like those resources. And then podcasts. There aren't very many podcasts just spouting nonsense and bad information out there. I think you get shut down fairly quickly. The FOMED community is not shy about telling you don't know what you're talking about. So, but I really, really enjoy a couple podcasts, and I go through phases. But right now, the okayest medic podcast, Mike, he's over in Pennsylvania, I think, is where he practices, and they do great topics, leadership and education and EMS education and topic and medical education stuff. And he brings on great experts. Some of the lesser known podcasts are not as fancy. They're not as sexy per se as like some of the really, really well known ones. I listen to the American Family Physician podcast. They cover topics that we run into as EMS practitioners all the time. Things, chronic illnesses that people deal with on a regular basis. And their perspective on treating people is fantastic. I love listening to that. You always pick up something. There's just some really, really good internal medicine and family medicine podcast stuff out there. I've mentioned a couple of them in the past, but that's kind of where I go. And my favorite thing to do is listen to them in the car on the way or to or from work or to or from school. And you pop them on, you get a good 20 minutes of education. I think that's a fantastic way to do it.
Yeah, I totally agree. I'm gonna name drop someone else out there because I think he's absolutely wonderful. His name's Dr. Jonathan Wallace. He's a colleague of mine that I first crossed paths with when I was doing my point of care ultrasound fellowship. He is a practicing physician in rural Canada who has actually now set up his own rural ultrasound fellowship for Canadians, which I thought was absolutely phenomenal. But he also dabbles in the podcast realm, and he does one called the R&R Rounds podcast, which is the Rural and Remote Rounds podcast, which I think has a lot of great information out there too, because our brothers and sisters in Canada, you want remote, they've got hours of transport times. Like they are out in the boondocks, and they've got to improvise quite a bit compared to what we have out here in the US. We're pretty spoiled even in rural settings compared to what some of the situations are up in the Canada area. One other thing that it came to mind to me too is that depending on what state you're in, there's obviously EMS associations. I know like South Dakota has an EMS association that's made up of medics and EMTs, and they have their own conference every year. I think Minnesota had one, but I think I just saw recently that theirs is disbanding. I'm not sure if that's true or not. I have to double check. But generally, I would think on a state by state basis, you've probably got an EMS association. Some of them try to make efforts to have a conference or some lectures or have some speakers to come on and talk about stuff, which I think is super helpful. But I would also say if you've got the money, or if your medical director or your relief association can send one or two medics or EMTs a year, get on out to NMSP. Like they love having paramedics and EMTs there, and there's stuff just as relevant to you guys and gals as there is to us. And sometimes it's great having one or two medics in the audience that kind of pop up and say, "Hey, I'm the one that's going to be in the back of the ambulance doing what you're telling me to do here, and I've got a question about X." And nothing gets a speaker more excited than having a medic or an EMT jump up and ask a question, because we're here for you guys and gals. Like we're there to help you all out. And so having you all represent medics and EMTs out there, like I think that's huge. I think that's great. I think there needs to be more of that kind of stuff. And hopefully in time we can continue to get more and more stuff out there that is kind of more FOMED, that's EMS friendly, not necessarily just for the EMS physician out there, but for the EMT and the medic as well.
So, Doc, looking to the future a little bit, what do we have coming down the pipe?
Coming down the pipe for us, we've got a couple exciting things that I'm looking forward to. Reagan and I actually just sat down and we were going to hash out some more protocols, just because it sounds like that is in demand from some of the people that we've talked to out there. They seem to really enjoy those. They like thinking through the process and having a case. So we've got, I think we just finalized 6 or 7 more. So we should have a couple more coming in no time in that regard. I've got a buddy of mine from the high school days who is now a stroke neurologist or an interventional neurologist. He's what did he say? One of 3 out in the Oklahoma area. So apparently he's kind of a big deal now. Don't tell him I said that, but really good guy, super smart. He's going to pop on at some point and talk to us about stroke stroke management, what that looks like, what our treatments are, what transports might look like for medications that have been given to the patient in the ER before you take them to a higher level of care. So, all that good stuff. I know he's a big time education fan as well, so he might have some caveats for us in that regard. Also in the works of trying to get one of my other good friends, Josh Chan. He's a former paramedic who has just recently stepped into a role of emergency department director, but he has a pretty cool nonprofit that he has set up that is designed to help first responders, EMS, law enforcement interact with the nonverbal patient or the agitated patient or the patient that has dementia. He's doing some really good work. He actually has some personal investment in that as well, and I think he's going to bring some really cool insight to the podcast. I'm excited to get him on here pretty soon as well.
That sounds great. So thanks for listening. This was sort of an impromptu recording that Doc and I wanted to do to get the year started on the right footing. And we, as always, appreciate you guys hanging with us. Make sure to check us out. Email us, send us any messages and questions that you have, and any ideas, things you want us to talk about. We're always open. And as always, thanks for listening.
Thanks, everybody. You have a good day.